Here's a number that will break your brain. In December 1944, George Patton's Third Army commanded just 12 divisions on the Western Front. Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group commanded 33. Patton received the lowest fuel priority of any major Allied force. His men fought with chronic supply shortages, borrowed ammunition, and captured German vehicles just to keep moving forward. And yet the entire German High Command positioned 11 panzer divisions, plus every single mobile reserve, within striking distance of Patton's front. Montgomery, with nearly triple the strength, faced just 6. Not because the Germans were stupid, because they were terrified. One man, a fraction of Allied combat power, and the most feared military force in human history couldn't stop losing sleep over what he might do next. This is the story of how a single interrogation transcript landed on Dwight Eisenhower's desk and shattered everything the Supreme Allied Commander believed about his own war. How one German officer's confession revealed that the Allies had been running their entire European campaign based on mythology instead of mathematics. And how Eisenhower quietly weaponized one general's reputation to reshape the final destruction of Nazi Germany. But before we get to that cold December night at Versailles, you need to understand why every single person at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force had been believing a lie for 6 months, and why that lie almost cost the Allies the war. By the autumn of 1944, the Western Front had become a grinding machine, eating men and material at a rate that made even the most optimistic planners at SHAEF headquarters lose their appetite during briefings. The euphoria of the Normandy breakout had evaporated like morning fog over the English Channel. Paris was liberated in August. The champagne flowed. Newspapers across America and Britain ran headlines promising the boys would be home by Christmas. They wouldn't be. The German army, which Allied intelligence had declared functionally destroyed after the Falaise Pocket, performed something military historians still struggle to explain. It reconstituted itself. Shattered divisions reformed. New units appeared from training depots across the Reich. The Siegfried Line, that massive belt of concrete fortifications along Germany's western border, suddenly bristled with defenders who had no intention of surrendering. Allied casualties mounted at a sickening pace. In the Hürtgen Forest alone, American divisions suffered losses comparable to some of the worst Pacific Island battles. Entire regiments disappeared into dark pine woods and never came out intact. The 28th Infantry Division lost over 6,000 men in just 18 days, fighting for terrain that could be measured in yards rather than miles. Supply lines stretched to the breaking point. Every bullet, every gallon of fuel, every medical bandage had to travel from Normandy beaches or through ports that weren't fully operational. The famous Red Ball Express, that convoy system running trucks 24 hours a day from the coast to the front, was literally wearing out faster than mechanics could keep engines running. Tires became more precious than ammunition. And at the center of this logistics nightmare sat one decision that consumed more of Eisenhower's energy than any German counterattack ever could. Who gets the fuel? Who gets the priority? Which general gets to attack while the others sit and wait? But everything was about to change because of something nobody at Supreme Headquarters was paying attention to. Not the Allied order of battle, not the supply charts, not the political cables from London and Washington. Something far more valuable was hiding in plain sight inside stacks of classified documents that intelligence officers filed and forgot. The enemy was telling them exactly who they feared most. And it wasn't who anyone expected. To understand what Eisenhower discovered that December night, you first need to understand the two men who dominated his every waking hour and most of his sleepless ones. Bernard Law Montgomery was, by late 1944, the most celebrated British general since Wellington. His victory at El Alamein in 1942 had turned him into a national icon, the man who finally beat Rommel when Britain desperately needed a hero. He wore his trademark two-badge beret like a crown. He spoke about warfare with the clinical precision of a surgeon describing an operation always methodical, always controlled, always certain. Churchill adored him. The British press treated his every pronouncement as gospel. At SHAEF headquarters, British liaison officers presented Montgomery's operational plans with a reverence that bordered on religious devotion. Maps showed blue arrows promising steady, unstoppable progress. Timetables laid out with mechanical precision. Risk factors calculated to decimal points. Montgomery commanded the main Allied effort in the north, driving toward the industrial Ruhr heartland of Germany. He received priority logistics. He held the prestigious axis of advance. He carried the weight of an empire's expectations on his narrow shoulders. His philosophy was simple, and he repeated it constantly. Concentrate overwhelming force, prepare meticulously, attack only when superiority is guaranteed, never risk a setback that could damage British prestige. George Smith. Patton Jr. was everything Montgomery was not. Where Montgomery calculated, Patton charged. Where Montgomery prepared for weeks, Patton attacked within hours. Where Montgomery spoke in careful, measured tones about scientific warfare, Patton screamed profanity at subordinates who moved too slowly and wept openly when visiting wounded soldiers in field hospitals. Patton commanded Third Army in the Lorraine sector, designated as a supporting effort, the military equivalent of being told to sit in the corner while the adults handled the real work. He received chronically inadequate fuel supplies. His requests for additional resources were met with polite bureaucratic refusal from SHAEF staff officers who treated logistics allocation like a zero-sum political game. And yet, every single day, Patton's arrows on the situation maps pushed forward. His divisions advanced despite being denied the resources his counterpart in the north received automatically. He fought with 12 divisions and produced results that made Montgomery's 33-division Army group look sluggish by comparison. The friction between these two men poisoned every command conference at Versailles. Montgomery demanded Eisenhower shut down all other operations and give him everything for one massive northern thrust into Germany. Patton demanded equal resources and the freedom to exploit his momentum in the South. Eisenhower, trapped between British political pressure and American newspaper editorials, tried to keep both men moving forward with a broad front strategy that satisfied neither. What nobody at SHAEF understood, what nobody even thought to investigate, was that while the Allies argued about fuel allocation and command authority, the Germans had already answered the question everyone was asking. They just answered it with tank deployments instead of staff memorandums. The intelligence had been accumulating for months. Ultra-decrypts from Bletchley Park, those priceless intercepts of German military communications, kept revealing the same pattern. Wehrmacht field commanders writing situation reports that mentioned Patton even when his sector was quiet. Orders referencing Third Army deception operations that didn't exist. Panzer divisions repositioning not against the main Allied effort, but against a supporting force that shouldn't have warranted such attention. Colonel Benjamin Monk, Dixon Patton's own intelligence chief, sent summaries to SHAEF noting something extraordinary. Captured German maps consistently marked Third Army positions with red danger zone annotations. Montgomery's entire Army group received standard defensive markings, the same notation used for secondary threats and quiet sectors. The G2 intelligence analysts at Versailles filed these reports as curiosities. Interesting anomalies. Footnotes in the daily intelligence summaries that senior officers skimmed past on their way to the operational updates they actually cared about. Nobody connected the dots. Nobody asked the obvious question. If the Germans are positioning their best mobile forces against our weakest sector, what does that tell us about our own strategic assumptions? Nobody, that is, until one cold December night when the Supreme Commander sat alone with a stack of interrogation transcripts and finally read what the enemy had been screaming for 6 months. December 10th, 1944. An interrogation facility behind American lines in Luxembourg. The room is bare concrete, cold enough that breath hangs visible in the harsh overhead light. A captured Oberst from 5th Panzer Army sits across a wooden table from 2 U.S. Army intelligence officers. His uniform is dirty, but his posture remains rigid with Prussian discipline. The questioning follows standard procedure. Unit identification, strength estimates, order of battle details. And then the German officer says something that stops every pen in the room from moving. His statement is clinical, almost matter-of-fact, delivered with the weary honesty of a professional soldier who knows the war is lost and has no reason left to lie. We know Montgomery will come. We can prepare defenses, calculate his build-up schedule, position our forces accordingly. His methods are predictable. Thorough, yes. Dangerous, yes. But predictable. Patton is something else entirely. We never know where he will strike. We never know when. So we must hold everything in reserve against him at all times. Every mobile unit, every panzer division we can spare. Because the moment we commit them elsewhere, he will find the weakness and exploit it before we can react. The transcript reaches SHAEF that evening. Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, reads it twice and paperclips a handwritten note to the front page before placing it on the Supreme Commander's desk. This matches 17 other interrogation summaries since October 17. Not an isolated opinion from one demoralized prisoner. A consistent pattern stretching back months. Confirmed by ultra intercepts. Confirmed by captured operational orders. Confirmed by German force deployment maps that showed the Wehrmacht's best formations clustered not where Allied strength demanded, but where German fear demanded. And now on December 12, 1944, at 21:40 hours, Eisenhower sits alone in room 24 on the second floor of the Palace of Versailles. Cigarette smoke hangs in dim lamplight. Maps cover every wall. And the Supreme Allied Commander reads one line that changes everything. All Panzer reserves positioned against Patton's probable axis of advance. Montgomery's front considered secondary threat. He reads it again. Then a third time. The cigarette burns forgotten in the ashtray. Coffee grows cold in the cup beside him, and in that silence, surrounded by maps showing a war, he suddenly realizes he's been fighting backwards. Dwight, David Eisenhower confronts the most uncomfortable truth of his command. The enemy doesn't fear his strongest force. The enemy fears his most unpredictable one. And he's been feeding the mythology instead of weaponizing the psychology. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. Because 4 days later, on December 16th, the Germans launched their massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes. 200,000 troops. Thousands of tanks. The last desperate gamble of the Third Reich, smashing through American lines in what would become the deadliest battle of the Western Front. And Eisenhower, armed with his new understanding of German psychology, was about to make the decision that would break the back of Hitler's final offensive. A decision that every military textbook said was impossible. In Part 2, we'll see how Patton performed the single most audacious military maneuver of World War II. How he wheeled an entire army 90 degrees in 48 hours during the worst winter in European memory. And how German generals already terrified of what Patton might do watched their worst nightmare materialize in real time as Third Army smashed into the southern flank of the Bulge with a speed that rewrote the rules of modern warfare. The question wasn't whether Patton could get there in time. The question was whether the Germans would psychologically survive when he did. In Part 1, we watched Dwight Eisenhower sit alone in a cold office at Versailles and discover that the German High Command feared George Patton more than any force on the Western Front. 17 interrogation transcripts. Ultra-intercepts confirming Wehrmacht panzer reserves clustered against Third Army. A mythology built on Montgomery's invincibility, crumbling under the weight of enemy deployment maps that told a completely different story. Eisenhower had just begun recalibrating his entire command philosophy when the Germans decided to test it for him. On December 16, 1944, 200,000 Wehrmacht soldiers and over 1,000 tanks smashed through the Ardennes forest in the most devastating surprise offensive the Western Allies had faced since D-Day. American units shattered. Entire regiments ceased to exist in hours. The German penetration ripped a 50-mile hole in the Allied line and kept pushing west toward the critical supply port of Antwerp. Within 48 hours, SHAEF headquarters at Versailles erupted into controlled panic. Staff officers who had spent months debating fuel allocation charts suddenly faced maps showing German armored spearheads racing through territory the Allies had considered safe rear area since September. And this is where everything Eisenhower learned in Room 24 was about to be tested against the worst military crisis of the European war. The morning of December 19, 1944. The conference room at Verdun is freezing. A potbelly stove in the corner barely produces enough heat to keep the coffee from cooling in the cups. Every senior Allied commander on the Western Front sits around a long wooden table. The mood is funeral. Maps spread across the surface show the German penetration growing by the hour. Blue Allied positions are being swallowed by red arrows that seem to multiply with every situation update. General Omar Bradley, commanding 12th Army Group, looks like he hasn't slept in 3 days. Because he hasn't. His forces took the initial German blow directly. 2 of his divisions in the Schnee Eifel have been surrounded. Over 8,000 American soldiers will surrender in the largest mass capitulation of U.S. forces in the European theater. Communication lines are severed. Intelligence is fragmentary. Nobody in this room knows exactly how deep the German penetration extends or where their armored spearheads are heading. Eisenhower opens the conference with a statement that catches everyone off guard. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us, and not of disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table. Silence. Several officers exchange glances. Opportunity. American boys are dying by the hundreds in frozen forests. 2 divisions have vanished from the order of battle. The entire northern shoulder of the Allied line is in danger of collapse. And the Supreme Commander wants cheerful faces. But Eisenhower isn't performing optimism for morale. He's operating on intelligence that nobody else in that room fully understands. He knows from the December 12th intercepts that the Germans have committed their mobile reserves. The panzer divisions that had been positioned against Patton's front are now driving west through the Ardennes, which means the German southern flank is exposed, vulnerable. And there is exactly one commander in the Allied force who can exploit that vulnerability fast enough to matter. Eisenhower turns to Patton. George, how soon can you disengage Third Army from the Saar offensive and attack north into the German southern flank? Every officer at the table knows what this means. Third Army is currently engaged in offensive operations facing east. Eisenhower is asking Patton to pull his entire army out of active combat wheel it 90 degrees north, move over 100 miles in winter conditions, and launch a major counterattack into the flank of the most powerful German offensive since 1940. The Staff College answer is 10 days minimum, probably 2 weeks for a responsible commander who wants proper logistics reconnaissance and prepared positions. Montgomery himself would require 3 weeks of methodical preparation before committing to such a maneuver. Patton's answer electrifies the room. I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. Dead silence. Bradley stares. British liaison officers exchange skeptical glances across the table. Major General Kenneth Strong. SHAEF's chief of intelligence later writes that several officers assumed Patton was grandstanding, making impossible promises to grab headlines while serious men tried to manage a genuine crisis. But Eisenhower doesn't flinch. He doesn't ask for revised estimates. He doesn't request a feasibility study. He looks at Patton and says 3 words that will reshape the Battle of the Bulge. Make it 72. What nobody in that conference room knows, what even Eisenhower doesn't fully appreciate until later, is that Patton has already anticipated this order. Before leaving for Verdun, he instructed his staff to prepare 3 contingency plans for wheeling Third Army north. His operations officer, Brigadier General Hobart Gay, has been working the logistics since December 17th. Phone lines to division commanders are already hot with preliminary movement orders coded to activate the moment Patton gives the word. This is the detail that separates Patton from every other general in the European theater. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't wait for permission. He studied the German penetration maps, saw the exposed southern flank, and began planning the counterattack before Schaeff even decided one was necessary. But planning and execution are separated by a chasm that has swallowed armies throughout military history. And what Patton is attempting has no precedent in modern warfare. Consider what Third Army faces. 250,000 men currently engaged in combat operations facing east. Hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, artillery batteries, supply trains, medical units, all oriented in one direction, all connected by communication networks and supply lines designed to support an eastward offensive. And Patton needs to reverse all of it. Disengage units in contact with the enemy without triggering a German counterattack into the vacuum. Redirect supply lines that took weeks to establish. Move divisions over roads that are iced over, cratered by bombing, and clogged with refugees fleeing the German advance. The temperature drops to 4 degrees below zero. Snow falls continuously. Vehicles slide off roads and block critical intersections. Fuel trucks can't maintain traction on mountain passes. Communication wires snap under ice weight faster than signal corps teams can repair them. And Patton's staff has 48 hours to make it work. Major General Manton Eddy, commanding 12th Corps, receives his movement orders at 2200 hours on December 19th. By midnight, his lead division is pulling out of prepared positions and heading north in blackout conditions. No headlights, no route markers. Drivers navigating by compass and prayer on roads they've never seen. The 4th Armored Division, Patton's spearhead, begins its 100-mile march before dawn on December 20th. Tank crews who were firing on German positions 12 hours earlier are now driving through blinding snowstorms toward a battle they know almost nothing about. They don't know enemy strength. They don't have detailed maps of the terrain they'll be fighting in. They don't even know exactly where the front line is, because nobody does. Colonel Creighton Abrams commands the lead combat team of 4th Armored Division, the same Abrams who will decades later give his name to America's main battle tank. His Sherman tanks push through ice and mud at speeds that chew through transmissions and snap tank tracks. Mechanics work through the night replacing broken components with bare hands in temperatures that cause frostbite in minutes. Here's the number that defines the impossible. In 72 hours, Third Army moves 250,000 men, an average of over 100 miles in the worst winter conditions Europe has seen in decades. 6 divisions pivot from east-facing offensive operations to north-facing attack positions without a single day's pause. They don't stop to regroup. They don't stop to resupply properly. They attack directly from the march. Military historians have studied this maneuver for 80 years. Most conclude it should not have been physically possible. The logistics alone required coordination that exceeded anything practiced in peacetime exercises. That it happened at all is a testament to something beyond planning. Something that lives in the space between a commander's will and his army's belief that impossible orders are merely difficult ones stated with conviction. On December 22nd, Patton's lead elements hit the southern shoulder of the Bulge. The 4th Armored Division strikes toward Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division has been surrounded and is running low on ammunition, medical supplies, and hope. The German reaction is exactly what Eisenhower's December 12th intelligence predicted. Ultra-intercepts captured in the hours after Patton's counterattack revealed German command circuits exploding with panic. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, commanding the entire Ardennes offensive, immediately diverts 2 panzer divisions from the western advance to block Patton. Not because Patton's initial force is overwhelming. 3 divisions against the full weight of a German offensive is barely a speed bump by conventional calculation. But Rundstedt isn't making conventional calculations. He's making psychological ones. Every German commander on the southern flank knows Patton's reputation. They've spent months positioning reserves against him. They've written situation reports warning about his exploitation operations. They've studied his speed, his aggression, his willingness to attack through gaps that methodical commanders would consider too risky. And now he's here, coming at their exposed flank with the velocity and violence that haunted their operational planning for 6 months. The diversion of those two panzer divisions creates a cascade effect that reshapes the entire battle. German momentum toward Antwerp stalls. Units that should be exploiting westward penetrations are ordered to hold defensive positions facing south. The offensive timetable, which depended on speed before the Allies could react, begins crumbling, not from Allied strength, but from German fear of what Patton will do next. On December 26th, elements of the 4th Armored Division break through to Bastogne. The siege is lifted. The 101st Airborne, which had answered the German surrender demand, with the famous reply, "Nuts," suddenly has a supply corridor and armored reinforcement. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Before Patton's counterattack, German forces advanced an average of 12 miles per day westward. After December 22nd, that advance drops to less than 3 miles per day, and then stops entirely in most sectors. Not because the Allies suddenly outnumber the Germans, but because Rundstedt committed 4 of his best mobile divisions to containing Patton instead of exploiting the breakthrough. 4 panzer divisions, pulled from the offensive, repositioned defensively, because one American general attacked from a direction the Germans feared most with a speed they believed was impossible. In the Schaeff war room at Versailles, Eisenhower watches the situation maps update in real time. Blue pins advance where German panic creates openings. Red unit markers that were racing westward begin clustering on the southern shoulder, drawn by psychological gravity toward the force they feared rather than the objectives they needed. He says nothing to his staff about the December 12th intelligence. Nothing about Room 24, or the interrogation transcripts, or the conversation with Bedell Smith. He simply watches the map confirm what one German officer's confession had already revealed. The enemy's decisions are shaped by fear more than by logic, and the man they fear most just proved exactly why they were right to be afraid. But breaking the siege of Bastogne was only the beginning, because as January 1945 dawned and the Ardennes crisis stabilized, Eisenhower faced a new challenge far more complex than any single battle. He now possessed a weapon that no military manual had ever described. A general whose reputation could pin down enemy reserves, redirect panzer divisions, and reshape German operational planning without firing a single additional round. The question was whether he could learn to wield that weapon deliberately, not just in crisis, but as a calculated instrument of strategic deception across the entire Western Front. And that question would lead Eisenhower to make a series of decisions in the spring of 1945 that remain among the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Decisions that weaponized psychology on a scale never attempted before. Decisions that the German High Command wouldn't understand until captured officers sat in Allied interrogation rooms months later and realized they had been fighting a ghost. Because in Part 3, we will see how Eisenhower turned George Patton into the most elaborate strategic deception asset since Operation Fortitude, how fake radio traffic, ostentatious preparations, and Patton's own reputation were orchestrated to pull German divisions away from the actual Allied main effort, and how the Wehrmacht, conditioned by months of terror, fell for it every single time. The war against German steel was almost over. The war against German psychology was just getting started. In Parts 1 and 2, we watched Eisenhower discover that the German High Command feared Patton more than any force on the Western Front. We saw that fear validated when Patton performed the impossible, wheeling an entire army 90 degrees in 48 hours to smash into the southern flank of the Ardennes offensive. German panzer divisions diverted from their main attack to contain a man whose reputation alone rewired their operational calculus. But breaking the bulge was a crisis response, a reaction to German initiative. What happened next was something entirely different. By January 1945, Eisenhower possessed intelligence confirming that Wehrmacht commanders had diverted combat forces away from active objectives 7 separate times since October, specifically because of Patton's perceived threat axis. 7 times. Not because of actual attacks, because of fear of attacks that hadn't happened yet. And now, Eisenhower asked a question no Allied commander had ever asked before. What if we stop treating Patton's psychological impact as a side effect and start using it as a deliberate weapon? This is where the war transforms from steel against steel into mind against mind. And the Germans never saw it coming. The first problem Eisenhower faced wasn't German. It was British. January 7, 1945. Montgomery sends a press conference transcript to Schaeff that detonates like a bomb inside Allied command relationships. Standing before reporters, Montgomery claims personal credit for rescuing the Ardennes situation, implying that American commanders lost control and that British leadership saved the battle. He describes the fighting as one of the most interesting and tricky battles he had ever handled. The reaction at Schaeff headquarters is volcanic. Bradley threatens to resign. American staff officers who watched Patton's Third Army break the siege of Bastogne, while Montgomery's forces moved with characteristic caution in the north, are furious. Eisenhower's chief of staff, Bedell Smith, tells colleagues the alliance is closer to fracturing than at any point since D-Day. For Eisenhower, the crisis is political dynamite. Churchill backs Montgomery publicly. American newspapers demand Patton receive supreme command of ground forces. The combined chiefs of staff in Washington and London exchange cables that read more like diplomatic ultimatums than military correspondence. But buried inside this political firestorm, Eisenhower sees something else entirely: an opportunity. While every senior officer in the Allied command structure is consumed by the Montgomery controversy, Eisenhower quietly authorizes a directive that will reshape the final campaign. The order goes to Bedell Smith, with instructions to distribute it only to a handful of senior intelligence and operations officers. Third Army will conduct ostentatious preparations for offensive operations in sectors chosen specifically to draw German mobile reserves away from actual Allied main efforts. All deception assets previously allocated to FUSAG operations will be redirected to support Third Army psychological operations, effective immediately. The language is bureaucratic, almost boring, but what it means is revolutionary. Eisenhower is formally converting George Patton from a tactical commander into a strategic deception weapon, not replacing his combat role, augmenting it with a psychological dimension that exploits everything the December intelligence revealed about German fear. But Eisenhower can't explain this to Montgomery, can't explain it to Churchill, can't even explain it to most of his own staff. Because admitting that Patton's reputation is more strategically valuable than Montgomery's army group would destroy the alliance he spent 2 years holding together. So the operation remains invisible, known only to Eisenhower Smith and a small cell of intelligence officers who begin orchestrating the most unconventional campaign of the European war. And then, the complications begin. February 1945. Third Army intelligence officers report that German signal intercept units have become increasingly sophisticated at tracking American radio traffic patterns. The Wehrmacht's Signals Intelligence Service, which had been degraded by years of Allied bombing and personnel losses, suddenly shows renewed capability in Patton's sector. The problem is immediate and dangerous. If Eisenhower plans to use fake operational preparations to draw German reserves, the deception must be convincing at every level. Radio traffic must match what German listeners expect from genuine attack preparations. Unit movements must be visible to Luftwaffe reconnaissance. Supply buildups must appear authentic to German intelligence analysts who have spent months studying Third Army operational patterns. Colonel Oscar Koch, Third Army's intelligence chief, identifies the core technical challenge. The Germans know Patton's operational signature better than they know any other Allied commanders. His speed, his communication patterns, his logistics, build-up sequences. They've studied him obsessively precisely because they fear him. Which means any deception must be perfect, or it will be detected immediately. 3 separate deception operations are planned and then scrapped when Koch's team determines that German signal intelligence would detect inconsistencies within hours. The frustration at Schaeff is palpable. They possess the most powerful psychological weapon of the war, but can't figure out how to aim it without the enemy seeing through the mechanism. Some officers begin questioning whether the entire concept is flawed. Maybe Patton's value is only authentic when his operations are genuine. Maybe deception will actually reduce his psychological impact by teaching the Germans to discount Third Army preparations as potentially fake. Eisenhower himself wrestles with the dilemma during a late-night session with Smith on February 18th. The conversation, reconstructed from Smith's personal notes, reveals a commander thinking through a problem nobody has ever faced before. The solution comes not from the intelligence community, but from Patton himself, though he doesn't know it. In late February, Patton begins aggressive preparations for crossing the Saar River. The buildup is genuine. Third Army is actually planning to attack. But Eisenhower realizes that the scale of preparation can be manipulated without changing the underlying reality. Let Patton prepare his actual offensive, then amplify the visible signatures. Additional radio traffic suggesting larger forces. Dummy supply depots visible from the air. Fake bridging equipment staged at crossing points that won't be used. The genius is that the deception is layered on top of reality. German intelligence can verify that Third Army is genuinely preparing to attack. The radio traffic contains real unit designations. The supply movements are authentic. But the scale appears twice as large as actual strength. And the axis of advance appears to threaten objectives far deeper into Germany than Patton's actual orders specify. March 1945. The Rhine crossing, the most critical Allied operation since D-Day. Montgomery prepares his massive set-piece crossing at Wesel in the north. Operation Plunder. 29 divisions. Elaborate air support. Airborne operations. The full weight of 21st Army Group committed to forcing the last great water barrier into Germany. Eisenhower needs German reserves away from Wesel. And he has exactly one tool that can reliably move German panzer divisions without firing a shot. Third Army begins ostentatious crossing preparations south of Mainz. Patton's engineers construct visible pontoon staging areas along the Rhine. Radio traffic increases dramatically. Supply convoys run around the clock on roads visible to remaining Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft. Artillery registration fires probe German positions across the river in patterns consistent with imminent large-scale assault. The German reaction is immediate and devastating to their own defense. March 15th. Ultra intercepts reveal 6th Panzer Army receiving emergency redeployment orders. 3 armored divisions begin moving south, away from Wesel, away from Montgomery's actual crossing zone, toward Patton's sector. German situation reports captured later describe frantic assessments of Third Army strength that overestimate Patton's forces by nearly 40%. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who has replaced von Rundstedt as commander in the West, issues orders that Wehrmacht historians would later call catastrophic. Hold maximum mobile reserves in the southern sector. Patton's crossing will be the main Allied effort. Montgomery's northern preparations are a supporting deception. He has it exactly backwards. March 22nd. Patton crosses the Rhine at Oppenheim. Not with the massive preparation Montgomery requires. Not with weeks of build-up and overwhelming force concentration. His 5th Infantry Division paddles across in assault boats at night. Almost no artillery preparation. Minimal air support. They catch German defenders completely off guard because Kesselring has pulled his best units south to block what he thinks will be Patton's main crossing further upstream. Patton's forces establish a bridgehead before German command even confirms the crossing is happening. By morning, engineers have a pontoon bridge operational and armor is pouring across. The phone call to Bradley becomes legendary. "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across. For God's sake, tell the world I'm across before Monty gets there." 24 hours later, Montgomery launches Operation Plunder at Wesel. The crossing that consumed months of planning thousands of tons of supplies and an entire airborne corps meets significantly reduced opposition. The German divisions that should have been defending the northern Rhine are 50 miles south, watching for Patton. The numbers are staggering. Montgomery's crossing at Wesel planned against an expected 3 German divisions in defensive positions. Encounters elements of barely 1.5. Casualty projections that estimated 4,000 Allied killed or wounded in the first 48 hours prove wildly pessimistic. Actual losses are less than half that number, because the divisions that were supposed to be there were chasing a ghost. Within 1 week of the Rhine crossings, the entire Western Front transforms. German defensive coherence collapses. Units that repositioned south to contain Patton can't return north fast enough to stop Montgomery's bridgehead from expanding. Units that stayed north are too weak to hold without the mobile reserves Kesselring sent south. The cascading effect accelerates through late March. Third Army drives east at a pace that stuns even SHAFE planners. Patton's forces cover ground faster than headquarters can update situation maps. 50 miles in a day, then 60. German units surrender in battalion strength rather than face Third Army's advance, not always because they're outgunned. Because the psychological collapse that began with fear of what Patton might do has metastasized into paralysis about what he is doing. By April 1st, captured German headquarters reveal the full scale of the psychological damage. Situation maps found in abandoned command posts show Third Army's position circled in red ink, annotated Hauptgefahr, main threat. Even in sectors where Patton operates as a supporting effort, German planners allocate disproportionate reserves against him. Operational orders reference Patton by name, something virtually unheard of in formal Wehrmacht communications about other Allied commanders. The statistical impact across the entire Western Front becomes measurable. German mobile reserve commitment against Third Army's sector averages 62% of total available panzer strength, against Montgomery's larger, better-supplied army group, 31%. Against all other American forces combined, 7%. One general, 12 divisions at peak strength, and 62% of every German tank the Wehrmacht can still move. Eisenhower watches these numbers compile in the SHAFE intelligence summaries through April. Each report confirms what he realized in Room 24, 4 months earlier. The mythology created in the enemy's mind is winning battles that firepower alone could never decide. German generals are fighting the war they imagine Patton will wage, rather than the war the Allies are actually waging. And every division they commit to containing that imagined threat is a division unavailable to stop the real advance elsewhere. The war in Europe has less than 5 weeks remaining. The strategic architecture of its final chapter has been shaped not by the largest army or the most resources, but by the psychology of fear, weaponized with a precision that no military academy has ever taught. But here is where the story takes its final turn. Because as Germany collapses and victory becomes inevitable, the question shifts from the battlefield to history itself. What happens to the man whose reputation won battles he never had to fight? What happens to the secret Eisenhower carried about? How psychological warfare shaped the endgame more than any operational plan? And what happens to the truth when the people who lived it decide the world isn't ready to hear it? In Part 4, we'll uncover the buried aftermath. How Patton died 9 months after victory without ever knowing his greatest contribution to the war. How Eisenhower took the secret to his grave and left only one cryptic line in his memoirs. And how classified intelligence files locked away for 30 years revealed a story that rewrites everything we thought we knew about how World War II really ended. The battles are over. But the most important chapter of this story has never been told. Until now. From a cold office at Versailles, where one interrogation transcript shattered 6 months of Allied mythology, through the impossible 90-degree turn that broke the Ardennes offensive in 48 hours, to the Rhine crossings where German panzer divisions chased a ghost while the real attack walked through undefended sectors. We've followed the story of how Dwight Eisenhower discovered that enemy psychology could be weaponized more effectively than any tank division in his command. But we left one question unanswered. What happened to the men at the center of this story when the guns finally fell silent? Because this story has a final twist that no one in that Versailles office could have predicted. A twist that begins with a car accident on a frozen German road, and ends with classified documents locked in steel vaults for 3 decades. And the truth it reveals is more uncomfortable than anything the Germans confessed in those interrogation rooms. Because sometimes the men who change history the most are the ones history remembers the least accurately. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The celebrations swept across Europe and America in waves of joy that masked the exhaustion underneath. Eisenhower stood for photographs. Montgomery accepted the German surrender at Lüneburg Heath with characteristic precision. Patton rolled into Bavaria with Third Army and immediately began governing occupied territory with the same aggressive instinct he'd brought to every battlefield since North Africa. But peace did not suit George Patton the way war did. Within weeks, Patton made public statements comparing Nazi party members to American political parties, suggesting that denazification was excessive and that former Wehrmacht officers should be retained to help administer occupied Germany. The headlines were devastating. The same newspapers that had championed Patton's battlefield genius now painted him as a Nazi sympathizer. Eisenhower, under enormous political pressure, relieved Patton of Third Army Command on October 2, 1945, and reassigned him to command the 15th Army, a paper organization tasked with writing the official history of the European War. It was a bureaucratic exile, and everyone knew it. Patton spent his final weeks reading through after-action reports and operational histories in a quiet office far from the front lines he had dominated for 3 years. Did he ever see the intelligence files showing how German commanders positioned their best divisions against him? Did he ever read the interrogation transcripts that changed Eisenhower's entire command philosophy? The historical record suggests he did not. Those files remained classified, compartmented within intelligence channels that even Army commanders couldn't access without specific authorization. On December 9, 1945, 9 months after Germany's surrender, Patton's staff car collided with a U.S. Army truck on a road near Mannheim. The impact fractured his cervical vertebrae. Paralyzed from the neck down, George Smith Patton Jr. lingered in a military hospital for 12 days. He died on December 21, 1945. He was 60 years old. The man whose reputation terrorized the Wehrmacht High Command, who pinned down 62% of German mobile reserves with 12 divisions, who made Field Marshal Kesselring commit the catastrophic error of pulling panzer divisions away from the Rhine crossings, never knew that his greatest contribution to victory wasn't the territory he captured. It was the territory the Germans refused to leave because they were afraid of what he might do next. Montgomery outlived Patton by 31 years. He published his memoirs in 1958, presenting the European campaign as a story of methodical British professionalism, occasionally disrupted by reckless American improvisation. He never mentioned the German deployment maps showing standard defensive markings against his army group, while Patton's sector blazed with red danger annotations. He was elevated to Viscount Montgomery of Alamein and died in 1976, his reputation as the war's premier Allied ground commander largely intact. Eisenhower carried the secret differently. He became President of the United States in 1953, serving 2 terms that defined the early Cold War. In his 1948 memoir, Crusade in Europe, he wrote thousands of pages about Allied strategy-command relationships and the political complexities of coalition warfare. About the psychological dimension that shaped his final campaign decisions, he wrote exactly 1 line. Sometimes the greatest contribution a commander makes is not what he captures, but what he forces the enemy to defend. 1 sentence, buried in a book of hundreds of pages. The entire secret of the final campaign compressed into 20 words that nobody without the classified context would ever understand. But the real legacy of what Eisenhower discovered in Room 24 extends far beyond one war or one general's reputation. The principle that enemy perception can be deliberately weaponized as a strategic asset transformed military doctrine in ways that remained classified for decades after the war ended. Operation Fortitude. The D-Day. Deception that placed Patton in command of a fictional army group to convince the Germans the real invasion would target Calais had already demonstrated the concept before Eisenhower's December realization. But fortitude was pre-invasion deception, a one-time trick designed to buy hours on a single day. What Eisenhower developed in the winter and spring of 1945 was something fundamentally different. A sustained psychological campaign that manipulated enemy force deployments over months by exploiting a single commander's reputation as a living strategic deception asset. This was not fake radio traffic or inflatable tanks. This was a real army, commanded by a real general, whose authentic aggressiveness was amplified to produce disproportionate enemy reactions across an entire theater of war. The United States military studied this dynamic extensively during the Cold War, though the studies themselves remained classified until the 1990s. The concept of perception management, using controlled information to shape adversary decision-making, traces directly from Eisenhower's exploitation of Patton's psychological impact to modern military doctrine. During the Korean War, General Douglas MacArthur's Incheon landing in September 1950 employed similar principles, using the commander's reputation for audacious operations to freeze North Korean reserves in positions defending against perceived threats rather than reinforcing the Pusan perimeter. The psychological architecture was identical. One commander's reputation pinning down enemy forces that were needed elsewhere. In the 1991 Gulf War General Norman Schwarzkopf's famous left hook maneuver succeeded partly because Iraqi commanders had positioned their best Republican Guard divisions against perceived main attack axes, based on coalition deception operations that deliberately exploited Iraqi fears about specific approach routes. The operational DNA of Eisenhower's 1945 campaign was embedded in the planning. Across 80 years of military evolution from Patton's Rhine crossing to modern cyber warfare and information operations, the principle Eisenhower discovered in that cold December office has only grown more relevant. The United States military's current doctrine on information warfare. Multi-domain operations and cognitive effects all trace intellectual lineage to the realization that shaping enemy perception can be more decisive than massing physical combat power. 23 NATO member nations now incorporate psychological operations doctrine that builds on principles first demonstrated when Eisenhower weaponized one American general's reputation against German operational planning. But the deepest lesson from Room 24 isn't about military technique. It's about something more fundamental, more uncomfortable, and more universally applicable than any doctrine manual could capture. The lesson is about how institutions process information that contradicts their operating mythology. For 6 months, Eisenhower had intelligence showing that the enemy's strategic calculations didn't match Allied assumptions. Ultra-intercepts. Interrogation transcripts. Captured deployment maps. 17 separate confirmations that the Germans feared Patton more than Montgomery. The data was available. It was accurate. It was sitting on desks at SHAEF headquarters in organized files with proper classification markings. And nobody acted on it. Not because the intelligence was hidden, because it contradicted the story everyone had agreed to believe. Montgomery was the main effort. Montgomery received priority resources. Montgomery's methodical approach was the model for Allied operations. This wasn't conspiracy. It was institutional mythology, the invisible framework of assumptions that organizations build around their decisions and then defend against contradictory evidence, because admitting the framework is wrong means admitting that months of decisions were wrong too. Eisenhower only confronted the truth when he sat alone with the raw data and allowed himself to see what it actually said instead of what he expected it to say. That moment of intellectual courage, the willingness to let evidence overrule institutional consensus, is rarer than physical bravery on any battlefield. Every organization, military or civilian, builds mythologies around its leaders, its strategies, its operating assumptions. And every organization resists information that challenges those mythologies, not because people are stupid or dishonest, but because the mythology works. It provides coherence. It simplifies decisions. It maintains the unity that complex organizations need to function. Until it doesn't. until the gap between mythology and reality becomes so wide that the enemy exploits it, or the market punishes it, or the truth simply becomes impossible to ignore. The question Eisenhower faced in December 1944, whether to trust institutional mythology or enemy intelligence, is the same question every leader faces when data contradicts consensus. And the answer, uncomfortable as it is, remains the same. The enemy's decisions tell you more about reality than your own assumptions ever will. And there is one final detail that most historians have overlooked. A detail hiding in declassified files that weren't opened until 1998, when the National Security Agency released a batch of World War II signals intelligence records that had been reclassified during the Cold War, for reasons that remain unclear. Among those files is a German 7th Army Situation Report, dated April 12, 1945, 3 weeks before the surrender. The report compiles Wehrmacht intelligence estimates of Allied command capability, ranking every major Allied commander on a threat assessment matrix that German Army group staffs use to prioritize defensive resource allocation. Montgomery is rated hochkompetent, highly competent. Predictable methodology, manageable threat through prepared defense. Bradley is rated gefährlich, dangerous, effective but conventional. Standard countermeasures apply. Patton's entry is different from every other commander on the list. The rating reads unberechenbar und operativ lähmend, unpredictable and operationally paralyzing. Operationally paralyzing. Not just dangerous, not just threatening, paralyzing. A single commander whose existence in the enemy's order of battle caused operational paralysis across an entire theater of war. But here's the detail that makes this document extraordinary. In the margin handwritten in pencil by an unknown German staff officer are 4 words that summarize everything we've spent the last 90 minutes exploring. Gegen ihn keine Lösung. Against him, no solution. 4 words. Written by a defeated officer in a collapsing army, the most honest assessment of psychological warfare's power that has ever been committed to paper. Against the fear that one unpredictable man created in the minds of professional soldiers who had conquered most of Europe, there was no solution, no tactic, no strategy, no weapon, just the paralyzing certainty that whatever they planned for Patton would do something else, and it would be worse. So here is the story complete. A Supreme Commander reads one interrogation transcript in a cold office and realizes he's been fighting his war backwards. He discovers that the enemy fears his most unpredictable general more than his most powerful army. He watches that fear validated when German panzer divisions chase a ghost across the Rhine while the real attack walks through undefended ground. And he takes the secret to his grave, because admitting the truth would shatter the mythology that held an alliance together.